me about your missions.
Well, the first mission was not the freighter, but it was the flotilla of cruisers and destroyers that we ran into. There was 6 of them. I don't know how many of them were destroyers and how many were cruisers. But we found them on search, turned, and put them on homing and came up upon it. And it was, the pilots talked it over and they decided that they were going to try the Norden bombsight. Since they'd had to put up with this Norden bombsight and drag it around as much as they were going to find out whether the thing would work for them or not.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did is we gained altitude. We were flying probably at 3,000 feet. We went up to close to 7. And then Mr. Lloyd said, let's put out a flare. So we tossed a flare out, and the flare worked, functioned correctly, the way it should. We could just make out these vessels.
Now, is the flare this 1 million candle
Yes.
power thing with a parachute?
It's on a parachute. It's 1 million candle power. It burns for a period of time, like 2 or 3 minutes, and then it goes out.
Mm-hmm.
So they threw it out, and Fisher was manning the Norden bombsight and had it set up, ready to go when we threw out the flare. And we didn't know what was going to happen when we put that flare out. Really, we didn't know whether they were going to start firing at us or what. And nothing. They didn't even indicate that we were there. And Fisher had an opportunity to try to, he had enough time, but he could not make out what we were trying to drop on.
It was just too dark, I suppose, huh?
It was not working. So I remember Eugene Howe, Bird Howe we called him. He was in the bow, and he had the bow set up so that Mr. Lloyd could squeeze off with the pistol grip pickle, we call it. He could squeeze off a bomb. So he was intending, I think, to just hit it and have one bomb go. But I don't know if it was a miscommunication or what it was, but they all went. All 4 of our bombs went. And all of them hit the water, and it didn't come even anywhere near any ship. And the ship still did not indicate that we were there, which was smart on their part, really. But we decided that the Norden bombsight was not the way to go. We're going to have to figure out a different system.
Well, that system, was that developed for daylight bombing over in Europe or something?
Yes, it was used by our Air Force. Yeah. And see, we had a daylight bomb site, and we're trying to work at night. And but Lloyd was enough of a Navy man that if the Navy told him to jump out of the plane without a parachute, he'd probably try it. But he tried it and it didn't work, so that was it.
Well, the other thing I suppose...
He never even carried it anymore.
Yeah. The other thing I suppose is the guys in Europe were up at, like 20,000 plus feet. Yeah. So maybe that machinery or that the bombsight wasn't really that effective.
There was something that wasn't working right.
Yeah. So
I didn't get involved in it because I wasn't in the bow.
Yeah. Later, then they went to a system with just visually getting close enough to the ship and hitting the button.
Get as close as you can get to the ship and drop the bombs, and drop them, in train, and hope for the best.
So there was an option of using the intervalometer where it figured some number of feet apart, or you could also just do a manual press of a button or something.
You you had an option. If it wasn't set up right now, and you push it, they'll all go.
The whole thing went. Huh.
But the next time we did it the way it was should have been done, and that was when we dropped on this.
So that's into December, like December 9th for the next mission? Or there were some other missions between the first one and the sinking of the freighter, Japanese freighter.
The freighter, there was another incident that where we dropped on a transport, but we didn't know exactly what happened because we didn't see the bombs hit anything. But they think, it was reported by another plane that this thing that we were dropped on was on fire, but I still don't think we were the ones that did it. I think somebody else did it. But they really opened up on us, and what they did was take action, and I found out what that was, and that was that when they were fired on, what they were going to do is go down and away, down and away from their course. So, in other words, if you're flying along here, they're going to dive down to the right in a turn to keep away from the ACAC. And that seemed to work out pretty well. But then the next thing was this freighter. And I am quite certain that they were told that that freighter would be where it was. But see, this isn't something they discussed with the crew, because they didn't want us to have a lot of information.
In case you got captured.
In case we were captured, and we didn't need the information. I mean, all we had to do was do our job.
So the what is it? The cryptographers, the people breaking the codes. Was that where the information comes from, or radar, or you really couldn't see it?
Well, here's what would happen. They were breaking that code, and then the code, the information was being given to the Aussie, and I'm not sure where their aircraft were, but they would put it in a canister, the information that they wanted us to have. They would put it in a canister, and they would come over about 4 o'clock and drop the canister. Now, we got the information. I mean, I saw that plane, I saw them drop stuff, but I didn't know what they were doing. Yeah. And so, what went on there, I don't understand.
Yeah, I suppose it could have been a coast watcher even saying, "Oh, there's something."
Yeah, it could be. It could be. But we were getting the information. Now, a coast watcher isn't going to dial us up or radio us or anything else, because they're telling somebody. Yeah. And they're telling code, I suppose. But anyway, I had a strong feeling that we knew that vessel was going to be there, because our radar went out, and we were just approaching the St. George Channel, and he turned and took the outside on the east side of New Ireland and went up about a third of the way and cut in across New Ireland. And where he cut in, we had, as soon as we saw the other coastline there, they said, there it is, and they saw this freighter, and it was just putzing along. We weren't looking at a big wake or anything like that. They were just chugging along. And I think they were concerned that if they did go fast and did make a wake, that it would maybe bring about an attack. I don't know what they were thinking. But anyway, we just went right into a glide, right down at them. Never hesitated, didn't do anything but run. And we went right down across them, and we went from the port bow to the stern, and just dropped 4 bombs, 500, 1,000, 500. And I think that the 2,000 pounders hit that deck, the deck of that ship, and it was, I think, an older ship. Probably went just right on down to the bottom of that ship and went off. Because I have never seen a ship go down that fast.
Now, how far on a glide attack, where the engines are the propellers are turning,
power on,
and but it's the angle. When you mean a glide, it's the angle as you come down, and then you're pretty low over the ship. Then how high would you be off of the?
I would say that on that ship, we were probably 300 feet over the up.
That is close to the ship. Couldn't the guys practically, fire a pistol over their head and hit you at that close
Probably
range?
could, but I don't think they had an inkling of an idea that what was happening,
Yeah.
Because we went down, and then he went on out a little ways and turned to the port, and I was in the port blister. He said open up, and I started firing, and shells are bouncing off all over the thing. He went out again and turned and come back so that the other gunner could strafe the ship. And the ship was
already upright and going down. Huh.
It was an unbelievable situation.
Yeah. Well, then
that's the first time I'd ever seen a ship sink.
Yeah. Well, so basically, could you see the ship? Was the lighting such that you could make out a ship?
The lighting was such that I think probably 80% of the shots that I fired would hit the ship.
And then, wouldn't you also be visible to them, or was the black paint?
But anything that, just think about that now. Here you are, and all of a sudden, boom, 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 there's a bunch of bombs that goes off.
Yeah.
You haven't got time to do anything, really.
Yeah. So it was like coming out of the night, and you were.
That's right.
That was it. Well, that must have been a real deterrent to the
Yeah, I mean,
guys.
we just thought, dude, what a piece of cake that was,
Huh. And they didn't have they weren't shooting any anti-aircraft out.
Never fired a shot.
Yeah. So that was a pretty easy mission that way.
It kind of got us fooled,
Mm-hmm.
This was the game, but it really wasn't.
So, when you got back to the base or whatever, did they have something that was like the 8th Air Force where they interrogate people and they say, what was your experience?
What did you see? What did you see? What did you see?
So as soon as you get back, then somebody's taken down everything that's occurred.
Well, the way they did it, you would go up if you had contact and tangled with a ship. You would go up to the captain's quarters, and you would tell the captain what happened, and he would decide, what whether he believed you or didn't believe you, or he asked questions,
So let's see. Then you also had another fairly intense experience with a bombing raid shortly thereafter on the 13th with a cruiser.
That was a totally different story.
Was there any missions between those two dates, the freighter and then the? That was the next mission?
No, wait a minute, I'd have to look.
Well, I've got here, December 9th for the Japanese freighter, being sunk, and then December 13th.
13th would have been the next top.
So what happened when you sank it? That was a big deal.
I've written that up, and you can look at what I wrote, because Hofflines wanted me to write it up for him. But what happened was, again, we were having trouble with the radar, and we had gone up through the strait and by Rabaul and gone up the west side of New Ireland. And up at the tip of New Ireland on the west side is a harbor called Aviation. It's a big harbor, and it was a very active harbor used by the Japanese. But when we went up there and made a turn and came back, and we're coming back down, just made the turn, and I looked down, and here in the mouth of this harbor was a long, fairly narrow ship with a, it didn't look anything like the freighter that we had encountered. And I reported on the intercom to Mr. Lloyd, and he didn't say anything back to me, and that really made me wonder, and we just kept on going, you know, and he didn't acknowledge that I told him anything. And evidently he had seen it also. And we continued on, I don't know, for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And I'd gotten to the point where I said, well, we're gonna, you know, I don't understand it, but we're evidently gonna bypass that. And about that time he turned to the outside, to the right, starboard, and we were in our run.
Now could you tell if it was a heavy cruiser, a light cruiser, or any? Okay.
It was, but they were.
It was a big ship, yeah.
And when we got straightened around on our run, that thing cut loose, and I have never seen anything like it. It was a fireworks demonstration in reverse. They were coming at us. I mean, they were coming at us on both sides, overhead. They were all over. I don't understand this day how any of that could have missed us. I mean, it was so intense.
There's a lot of guns on a cruiser, all over the cruiser, isn't there?
Right, and they had evidently picked us up with their sound, and knew we were there and waiting. And when we turned, I don't know whether they had radar or what, but they really blasted us. And that's when he evidently just jammed that yoke. And when he did that, I was airborne. And I came down, and looked over, and Saddle was already down in the bilges, you know. And so I got up, and I no more got up, and he did the same thing again. And this thing was, they would kind of hesitate when he'd do that, and then they'd start in again, you know. And he did that 3 times.
So he was trying to get the elevation or altitude down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was trying to get under the fire. Is what he was trying to do, and he evidently was doing a pretty good job of it. But
could you see from the side forward?
I could see forward. If I stood up and looked forward, I could look right at it, you know. Because you can stand in that, if you notice that blister, you can stand there and look forward. It was really, really scary. I mean, because I could not figure out how they could be missing us. And then we got down, we were pretty low, and I'd say maybe 200 feet. And when we went across that thing, it just sounded like a whole bunch of people were pounding away on the bottom of the plane with hammers.
And that was the firing of the...
They were firing up at us.
Well, you're lucky to be here.
Well, not only that, but then I thought that, I mean, when we didn't, I expected us to pull up, you know. But instead of pulling up, he kept going down. And as he went down, he started to turn to the right. And when he did that, then everything else in the harbor opened up. We had them coming from all directions. Mm-hmm. Forward, backward, sideways, everywhere. And I'm sure they were shooting right into each other. I mean, they had to be the way they were firing.
Was that part of the pilot's strategy, was to get in a position where between the ships where they wouldn't fire because they would be hitting each other or something? I don't
think so. I don't think he knew the rest of them were there. But we were just trying to get out of there at that point. Mm-hmm. And but I do think that he knew what he was doing when he stayed down. He was trying to stay out of the line.
He probably got out of there quicker that way, I suppose.
Well, and you know, if he'd have pulled up, then they'd have just pumped it right in the tail. Mm-hmm. But he didn't. He just looked. And that wing, to me, it didn't look like it was over 5 or 10 feet off of the water. Mm-hmm. When he turned, you could see the, you know.
What happened with the bombs? Did any of the bombs strike?
Bombs all dropped, all armed, and you can always tell when the bombs are armed because the wires will be hanging there when you get done. Mm-hmm. The arming wires stay with the plane. So you always knew whether the bombs were armed when they dropped.
And they hit the cruiser or missed it, or?
Yeah, they hit, and it looked. When we looked back, it almost looked like there was water coming over the back, the stern. But I don't know whether it was or not. But it just looked. It almost looked like they were they were towing something, you know. And but it was a wild and scary deal.
Yeah, I would think so. From I can't imagine all that going at you and then hitting the thing and not.
And then Lloyd says, "Is everybody okay back there?" And I said, "I don't know." And so Jake came back and when I hung on to this machine gun handle, it was oily. And my arm gets numb when I really get totally excited. So my arm is numb and it's a sticky feeling, you know. So we didn't know for sure whether I got hit in the arm or not until we pulled back my jacket and felt my arm, and it was all right. Wasn't it?
Felt just like sticky blood on the handle. So from that point, then, did you fly back to base, or?
We flew. We started gaining altitude and got into some scattered clouds, and turned and started back down the outside of New Ireland on the east side, and then night fighters started coming at us, but the Japanese don't have real stomach for night fighting. And they're not equipped for it, and for that reason, I don't think they like to do it.
Did they have any kind of a night radar like we did with some of our night fighters, or?
No.
It
The
was just a
Japanese
visual?
radar was, they had radar, but it was, we think it was inoperable almost all the time.
Mhm.
It didn't indicate to us that, no, for sure they didn't have it on their planes. But we could see them, you know, but they weren't making runs on us.
Well, you must have been a hard target to see with the black paint and
Well,
flying at it.
absolutely. It was very hard to see. It was probably our best weapon, was the fact that we were camouflaged.
Now this, which I think is very clever, this business of changing is it the speed of the engine, is how you throw the sound off?
We would run one engine faster than the other engine, and thereby making these engines, instead of making the same pitch and everything, it would make a different sound, and it was just enough to throw off their sound detection. I think the sound detection still worked, but they couldn't tell where we were for sure, and they couldn't tell how many of us there were for sure.
So by putting the engines out of sync, the sound actually was just off, and so they didn't know exactly, listening, where the position of the airplane was, or how many airplanes it was up in the air, in the dark. And who came up with this? I've never heard anywhere about this, tactic.
It was just something they did automatically. I think that probably VP-11 was the one that started, I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's a clever, when you think about it, that isn't something.
But see, there weren't many, the Germans I don't think were into sound detection like the Japanese. They were leaning very heavily on sound detection.
Yeah.
And we were just trying to counteract their strong point.
Well, that sound was a World War I thing for the Germans, but then they went into radar and more sophisticated things in World War II, I think.
Well, this radar that we had stemmed from the British. They were the ones that came up with that airborne radar.
Well, I imagine people were pretty excited back at the base to hear you had successfully dropped bombs on a cruiser. They
were very excited about it, and that's the first time that I've ever had a drink of whiskey. Was at the captain's quarters.
That was your first drink?
First drink of whiskey that I had on board a ship.
So they
poured each one of us a drink in a glass.
Well, the tradition, I believe, in the 8th Air Force was often they got a shot after, any combat mission, so a little different in the Navy.
The Navy did not like to serve liquor on their ships.
Yeah.
But, British, they served it every day. They gave them a ration of rum or
something. We were last talking about the bombing of the Japanese cruiser on December 13th, 1943. And then the next, was it the next mission? Or no, this would have been quite a bit later.
Yes.
The bombing of the Japanese base in March 29th of 44. And how do you pronounce the name? Is it Wolei?
Wolei. And it's W-O-L-I-A, something like that. Is the way it's spelled.
Where was it? Which island was that?
It was an island. It was meant to be a very large and active Japanese supply base, almost straight west of Truk. And it was, for some reason or other, they thought it was very important to bomb Wolei. And so they didn't, Wolei was reportedly very heavily armed base. So they thought it would be much less costly to bomb Wolei at night rather course, opened up the possibility that they would be using the black PBYs to do that. So what they did, it was something that I'd never seen done before, and that is there were 5 planes that were picked to bomb Woolly Eye. And they were going to go over the island at different times. We're not going over the island all at the same time, but we were going to take turns. And that didn't sit well.
You lose the element of surprise, though.
Absolutely. I mean, we knew we had been pretty experienced by then, and we knew that, you know, the less warning you give to the enemy, normally the better off you fare. Mm-hmm. And we were picked to go third, and we could visualize them really being storming like a bunch of hornets by that time. I mean, 2 planes, and now there's another one up there. So we were mumbling under our breath about that. But then another thing happened, and they chose to bomb this island. It was earlier in the week, and then as the week progressed, this terrible weather set in. And a storm, and it was a really bad storm, tropical storm, that lasted like days. And so we take off, and with the Navy, they operate totally different on navigation than the Army does. The Army has a navigator, and everybody abides by what that navigator says. The Navy doesn't seem to trust any one navigator. They pick a navigator, and he's designated as a navigator for that flight, where they have multiple pilots. And he navigates, but the other 2 also navigate. And they navigate just like, you know, I don't trust you, I'm going to do my own thing here. And they navigate on their knee, they call it. So we got 3 guys navigating, and it makes the navigator a better navigator. And plus, we had pretty well mastered how to use that search radar for navigation. Well, anyway, we start out for Woolly Eye, and we're going to be third over the, you know, woe is me. So we start out, and it's really storming, and we cannot get the aircraft. It wants to fly sideways. Mm-hmm. It won't level out. So we're flying sideways all the way out there. Well, like I say, we're more experienced at this warfare by now, and my job that night was to throw out the incendiaries. We're going to use incendiaries, which was pretty common. In fact, the Japanese used incendiaries a lot. But I never was on a mission where our only job was really, well, it wasn't our only job, but a big part of our job was that incendiary. So the incendiaries are thrown out the waste hatch. And just a long story short, when they're in a big bundle, they're packed together, and you hook a lanyard onto the incendiary bomb, which is a big round thing with a whole bunch of little incendiary bombs. And when that lanyard gets to the end of the line, it jerks off the wrapping of the incendiary bomb. That strapping around. And when that happens, all these little pins come out of these individual bombs. And now they're armed, and if they hit anything, they're going to start one heck of a fire. Well, I also, when you throw things out of the tunnel hatch, there's one thing that happens that you don't want to happen, and that is you are in back of the relief tube. And so you got to be careful now. So anyway, Mr. Lloyd said we'll be going over the target probably in 10, 12 minutes. And so I go back and, wait a minute, before that, I go back and drain the tunnel hatch, because as you pull that up, there's air rushes in, and if there's anything in the crevices around that door, it blows into the tunnel hatch. So I stood way over the side and I drained the tunnel. Then, as we approached the target, Lloyd said, you know, in 10 to 12 minutes we're going to be over the target. Well, my attention was diverted other places, and I didn't think far enough ahead to know that these guys are going to relieve themselves before we go over the target.
And right before they went over the target.
Right. Anyway, we got to man your battle stations, and I run back the tunnel hatch, and normally would be in a blister because I was second Ordnanceman there, and I opened it up, just sprayed all over me. And about that time, they opened up, and there's flak coming heavy, you know. And I'm sitting there waiting to throw these incendiary bombs out, and stuff's dripping off my nose, you know. And what a hell of a way to die, you know. And it wasn't funny at the time, but I dumped. They told me we'll tell you when to dump those incendiaries. So they told me I dumped them, and it got into the base and started some fires there. And then we also dropped our regular bombs too with the daisy cutters on, because we were at some pretty good altitude.
Now, did you have more than one to throw out, or did you?
No, just one. And but remember that. Then we were kind of amazed that it wasn't a lot more flak, because we'd heard this base was really armed to the teeth. And being third over the target, we just expected a little more. So anyway, we turn and start for home. And now, when we turned, the plane was it just would not fly right. And I was sitting there in my station. I'm looking like up toward up at the sky rather than down, you know, because the plane's on a tilt.
Now, was this from the flak, or
That's
was it
from the wind?
Wind. Oh, okay.
And no, the flak was way behind us. Flak was in Wolleye. But we're flying, and you know, and I think, boy, this weather is really bad. And anyway, Mr. Lloyd came back to use the relief tube. And I thought the weather was not good, but I mean, I didn't feel threatened at all. But anyway, he come back from using the relief tube, and sitting there looking out, and he put his arm around my shoulder. He was shaking like a leaf. I thought, he says, "Don't worry, boy." He says, "We're going to get you back, all right?" I wasn't worried up to that point.
You weren't worried until then.
But to finish the story, he was getting, his nerves were getting the best of him. And that was his last flight. He went back to States.
Mm-hmm.
And he was starting to see things, you know. I think it was St. Elmo was fire or something, but he kept seeing these lights and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, we always said, you know, if anything happens to this guy, it's going to be coffee nerves, because he drank coffee like it was no tomorrow. But anyway, as it turned out, we were the only aircraft that dropped on Woolley that night.
Oh, the others got lost in the storm?
Couldn't find it. But that spoke very well for our navigators.
Yeah. Well, and to get through all that storming and everything else to find it.
It was a tough night on the pilots.
Yeah. And in the dark. Well, would it show up on the radar if you were close?
Yeah, they were using radar. They used the radar more, not so much homing. Mm-hmm. You know, they wouldn't look for Woolley on a homing. They were looking to the sides to see how far land was. And from them, then he would take that information to the chart. Mm-hmm. And figure out, is that checking, you know, with the land on this side and land on that side, or whatever, land ahead of us.
So, if I understand this right, so there might be 3 pilots, and one would be assigned, on this mission you're the navigator, and the others would do it themselves, and it's kind of a check on whether... If
they wouldn't be running back and forth from the pilot's seat to the radar. Mm-hmm. They were more or less going on, you know, where it should be. Mm-hmm. Now, the guy that's the navigator, he's taking star sights, mm-hmm. in addition to his other navigational equipment. Mm-hmm. And they're back there with their sextants or whatever it is.
Well, you were far enough south. Did you have problems with like the magnetic north being off, or any of that kind of problem, or that was probably more up in Alaska and the
no, we weren't that close to the poles.
Yeah.
We were close to the equator.
Yeah.
But no, the navigation in the water out there is, you know, mm-hmm. I don't think the Army. I think that was another thing that kept them from operating at night was the tough navigational problems that were caused by all that water.
Well, you couldn't make a mistake over the Pacific either, because there was so much water compared to the...
You made a mistake. Nobody ever found out about it. But they would resort to using the homing mm-hmm. device.
Yeah.
You know what that is? That round thing that sits up on top of the plane that they could change it. See, in other words, that's how they find the beam. Mm-hmm. And the beam will take them to back home. Mm-hmm.
So it's a radar, is a radio signal, isn't it? That the beam is basically, and then if you get to the left or the right, you could kind of tell by the sound.
That's right. If you get, you know, the sound weakens in, you got to turn back to where the sound strengthens.
Yeah.
They're following the beam.
Yeah. So Mr. Lloyd was Rudy, who's his first name?
Rudy Lloyd.
And he was a pilot?
Yeah. He was the PPC, and he was a Lieutenant JG.
Yeah.
The other 2 guys were ensigns.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know just if people that ingest a lot of caffeine don't sleep too well, and eventually they can actually start to hallucinate from caffeine.
He might have been.
Yeah. Plus he's got all the stress of. Was he? But he'd been there for a while then.
Well, he hadn't been. in the combat area any longer than we had. But of course his responsibility is a little different than ours. But he had this coffee thing so bad that he would look at his watch, you know, when we get on the aircraft, and it was a race to get the coffee on and get the burners on and get the water in there, of course, and he wanted his coffee within so many minutes. And at the end of that time, his arm would come back like this. He's flying a plane, you know, and his arm is back here.
Where's his coffee?
He wants that cup when he comes back around. So he had it pretty bad.
Well, the medical studies on caffeine show that people start to see, like, floors start looking shiny, and they'll start to actually see things.
That is
he might have had a caffeine problem.
That is probably very true.
So did you get a replacement for him then at that point, or?
No, what happened was I was transferred to another crew. And I went from second ordnanceman to first ordnanceman in Bill Patterson's G crew, I think it was. And so I am now a first ordnanceman. However, the other thing that affected that was that when we attacked the cruiser, a request was put in that all of the crew members would be jumped a rank. And my increase in rank, see, when I joined the squadron, I was, or take it back one step further, when I got out of NATTC, I came out a third class petty officer. Then when I joined the squadron, I had a lot of time in as a third class petty officer. And I was, you know, I was eligible to take my second class, which they gave me as soon as I joined the 52. They were in favor of moving the guy up in rank as soon as they could. So I took the test for second class and it immediately came through. And then I'm only second class for probably 2 months. And we hit the cruiser, and it's recommended that the crew be elevated to class. So now I'm first class. And I'm eligible to be the first ordnanceman.
So you get more pay, I assume, and then do they have different responsibilities, or is it the same?
Most of the time, but not necessarily. When you're first class, you are generally the lead mechanic or the lead radioman or lead ordnanceman in that crew. But sometimes you'll find a crew that has a first class plane captain who is always a mechanic. And there'll also be another first class mechanic who is under him. And chief is the same way. You might have a chief that's in first class was the top radioman, and then there'll be a first class radioman under him. You won't have two first class chiefs. I mean, 2 chiefs of the same rank.
So you had to sort of integrate into a new group of people then?
Yes, a new crew. And that crew, I've got them listed in that one page in my flight log.
The notes here say the assignment was April 15th of 44 then. Well, did you stay with them for a period of time, or did you stay with them for the rest of the time you were there?
No, I moved up when Captain Eisner took over the squadron, he could pick his crew. And his was the A crew, and he flew in plane number 52, you know. So and I always picked to fly in his crew. As first ordnance.
And then there was a search for a crew that happened?
Right. And that was, again, truck was involved in this. And the Army had gone out in the daytime and bombed truck, which is very heavily on our base, and had gotten pretty badly shot up and was losing altitude and so forth, and went down and ditched in the big vast area between the Admiralties and truck. One of our very seasoned pilots by the name of Vic Weaver was patrolling that area and was called when they found out that this B-24 had gone down. And Weaver immediately started searching for this crew, and he had an excellent crew, and they found the B-24 crew that was down. And they were down, they lost some of their men in coming down, but they were down and they were in the life raft. And when Weaver found them, Weaver said, it's really way too rough to land, but we're gonna land. And anyway, they went down and tried to make a full-stall landing. And it was too rough, and the tail caught a wave and it flipped the plane right over on. Instead of flipping, it flipped it this way, even though the wave hit the tail, it must have pushed it up in the air, and the plane nosed over and turned upside down.
So it was a full somersault of the
It was
thing.
a somersault, not a full somersault.
180, yeah.
And was not good. Satterfield was he was in the plane captain seat between the wings, and the putt-putt auxiliary engine tore loose and pinned him in there. Boston, one of the radiomen, second radioman, he hit the radio and split his head, sheared half of it off. And one of the pilots went through the windshield, so we lost 3 guys. The rest of them got out. They got their lifeboat out, and now B-24's crew is in the water and the PBY crew is in the water. And when one of your own crew goes down, then that's different.
Everybody's at full attention. Yeah.
And anyway, we all turn out, all the planes.
Oh, really? The whole squadron went out after that? Huh.
And what they do is they have more of a blanket search rather than a sector search. They line the planes up, so they're all flying together, and they can see into each other's area. And that's how we searched for them anyway. And we found them.
Now this is in daylight
In
at this
daylight,
point?
yeah.
So you guys are all visible if there was a fighter
Yeah,
around?
that's right, but there's not too much activity by the enemy in that area.
Mhm.
And, so we didn't, you know, and a random fighter plane won't tackle several of planes like that. We didn't think anyway. So we weren't too worried about that. But we found them, and then they immediately alerted a destroyer escort. And the destroyer escorts started for the guys that were down. And then, but we stayed there and went, you know, and circled until we could see that the destroyer escort was coming, and the destroyer escort knew where they were at.
Was it still rough?
It was still rough, but it wasn't as rough as it was when they went down.
Yeah.
But it was rough enough they didn't want to send any other planes down there.
Oh, did the plane sink then, that when it was upside
yeah.
down?
The one that was, well, the B-24 sunk and the PBY sunk, both of them. But the B-24, of course, sunk a long time before the PBY. But the thing that happened was that we were back to the Admiralties. That's where we were flying out of. Seattler Harbor, they call it. Big, big harbor. And we went back and we were circling around, getting ready to land, and I passed out in the gun tub. And I mean, it was just lights out, and no, you know.
What, do you know why? Was it
well,
like
they brought me around, and when I came around, they said, we gotta get you checked for malaria. And so when I got back to we were operating off of a tender at that time. And as soon as I got to the tender, they took me down to sick bay and checked to run blood tests. Because the Navy, for some reason or other, they don't want to just treat you for malaria when they aren't sure it is malaria. So they want to be sure that they are finding the parasite in your blood before they...
What's the reasoning for that?
I don't know.
They had limited supplies of
well, yeah,
drugs
that's
or
one
something?
of it, but I think probably it's detrimental to do it, to treat somebody for that disease.
That you'd be exposing to a risk or something, maybe.
It could be that the future treatment would be affected because you would have built up some immunity or whatever, I don't know.